Good afternoon, Websummit. Lovely to see you all still here and braving the storms. And I'm delighted to be hosting this panel on post-liberalism and technology. And I think it's a tech audience, it's a bright audience. I think let's get them through a pol sci degree in, let's say, 2 minutes or so. I think if we're going to have this chat, what do we mean when we say liberalism or the liberal order? If we're going to be talking about that for the rest of the session.
So after the end of the Cold War, what did everyone expect the global economy to look like? Well, everyone expected that we would be entering an era of completely smooth, problem-free, global free trade. Things could be made everywhere, and in the Western societies, we could turn more toward the service sector. So there was an idea behind this, we can call it liberalism, which was the motivating principle. And this is that we need to break down all the traditional barriers, the traditional borders, basically, traditional ways of life, and usher in a new, technologically empowered, basically global single market and global, one world. You can still see this in the brands of some of the, like the airline group One World refers to this expectation and this hope. But it hasn't been working out that way. And for about the last 10 years, people have seen the populist movements come up, and they've seen many people dissatisfied with their way of life and their economic prospects in this supposed coming global utopia. Now add in the fears about AI on top of that, and now we have a political problem. Now we have a clash between expectations and reality, and that's what we're interested in.
And we should sort of, before we jump further in, there's a bit of disentanglement here, because a lot of people, certainly in America, would use liberal to mean left of center, sort of, how we might use social democrats. And they would often say, we're not free traders, we're not economic liberals in that sense. You have quite a lot of figures who identify now sort of with the modern right and would not say that they are certainly liberals in any sense of that, say they're a classical liberal. We have a whole mesh of definitions. When we say we're looking at post-liberalism or the collapse of liberalism, do we mean one of those is in crisis, all of them, given the lack of connection? It's, sorry, very amorphous, but...
No, I mean, I think it's more than just a left-right political question. It's about what are our expectations of the political and economic system, and how can we best understand that? So in the future, will people's hopes and expectations be realized at the completely global level? Will we have a globally interconnected world that's functioning? Right now, it seems like the globe is rapidly fracturing into different zones. People are coming to see that it's not good enough for them just to buy cheap products that are made elsewhere in the world, if it means that the focal industries of their own community have been destroyed or set aside. So that's the kind of framework or the level. I mean, I know everyone gets nervous when the suits show up and we start talking about political science, but this is about the tangible expectations of people for the economy of the future, and what role does the software tech industry and the hard tech industry play in that?
And of course, if any industry is globalized, it's tech. We all, pretty much outside of China, we use the same major platforms, we use the same services, we talk about the same companies. Philip, I'll pull to you. Your book is called The Collapse of Global Liberalism. If we're saying that it's under crisis, why is it collapsing? What would you contend has gone wrong?
So I think there's two things happening at the same time. One of them is the collapse of liberalism globally, and I think that's basically happening because non-liberal or illiberal countries are now becoming very powerful and very wealthy. China is substantially the largest economy in the world. China is not a liberal society by any definition. India is not a liberal society. Russia isn't a liberal society. These are the big major powers in the 21st century, and there's no indications that they're going to become liberal. I think some people in the 1990s following maybe Francis Fukuyama or something, thought that they would become liberal. But I think we're becoming increasingly aware that they're not. So that's one part of the collapse, it seems to me. The second part is that I think, as Gladden was alluding to there, domestically, liberalism doesn't really seem to be working anymore at multiple levels. I think liberals in the 90s especially, although the project is 500 years old, actually, it goes back very, very far. In the 90s, I think there was this expectation that, you know, the boom of the Clinton era would set in and living standards would just keep going up and everyone would become more liberal and more friendly and everyone would be really happy. And that hasn't happened at all. In the liberal societies themselves, there is now intense political conflict, and that wasn't expected in the 1990s. So we're seeing a crisis of liberalism at the international level because of the rise of illiberal powers, and at a domestic level because the promises weren't really delivered, I think.
So let's get into sort of some of the crunch on where this sort of looks. One quite obvious sort of economically liberal, free trade sort of perspective is it doesn't matter where goods are built, go for comparative advantage, import what you need. And we've done that for a long time, but you're suddenly seeing countries across the world looking very seriously at silicon chip manufacture. As we've got an AI race, as we need them in cars, as we need them in all sorts, for security reasons, for supply chain solidarity, etc. A lot of places are looking to try and control that manufacturing stack. So on one level, it's clear evidence for a post-liberal thesis. On another, they're discovering just how complicated that is. And it's not just in a case of China can make everything and no one else can. You have Taiwan, who's crucial for this. If China ran the show, that wouldn't be the case. You have certain advanced chip designs that rely on America or rely on Europe or the Netherlands. Does this show, you know, what do we think looking at this? Does it not show how globalized these chains are and how hard it is to unpick? Would it not be wasteful to replicate it? Or does it show the thesis of, actually, we have to care about this, we have to separate it? You can look at it any way you want, can't you? It's a Rorschach blot.
Well, I definitely think the recent, related to chips, the recent rare earth restrictions that China put in place that are required for many of these chips and so on in the United States, shows just how, as you say, globalized and integrated the economy is. I think what's happened is basically the liberal free trade arguments went too far in the 90s and they hollowed out manufacturing and so on in the West. And I think actually, I'm a little bit of an economic determinist in this regard, I think actually a lot of the deep anxiety in the Western countries is less so cultural or even nationalistic. I think it's economic, a lot of it. Loss of good jobs, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of this was discussed when Trump first got elected, and then they kind of forgot about it as the cultural conflict intensified between liberals and conservatives and so on. These are economic problems. The issue is that I think that a little bit of magical thinking slipped in. People thought, well, all we have to do now that we've realized that this model was a bad idea is we just have to reverse it, you know, by fiat, by force, and that's not working out. The reindustrializing Western economies probably needs to happen, but it's going to be very complex and very difficult, and I think we're going to have to be very realistic about that. And I think in the short term, trying very intensive trade war, well, we've seen where it goes. It doesn't work properly. So I think my ideal would be if everyone kind of calms down a little bit and we have a broad discussion of how you actually get from A to B in terms of onshoring or reindustrializing.
Beyond where we're looking at critical security manufacture, how much of this is nostalgia or is reminiscence, maybe even for a past that doesn't exist? You know, I look at where manufacturing is reshored. Modern manufacture, especially in Western countries, is extremely high-tech, really low staff, and usually now, post-union, quite low-paid. You can see factories reopen and produce high productivity, good goods. Manufacturing is a bigger sector in most European countries than the discourse suggests. If we reshore manufacture, does it actually lead to the skilled jobs and the valued work that we imagine, or is this not just hearkening back to something that isn't coming back?
Well, I think that manufacturing occurs at many different levels, but what we've begun to learn over time is that they work synergistically. The basic infrastructure that you need in order for manufacturing COVID masks is also essential for higher forms of manufacturing. Basically, you're not really going to be able to do one in the long run if you can't do the other. The whole manufacturing ecosystem works together and also provides a lot of opportunities for software-oriented tech companies to come in and optimize these processes. But ultimately, we live in real political societies. There are millions of people without work in Europe today. There are millions of people without work in the United States today. So someone is making even simple products, and ultimately it's a life that leads toward dissatisfaction if, well, yes, there's various levels of high-end manufacturing, but I can't get a job because the COVID masks or the basic materials are made somewhere else. So there have been a number of red flags that have brought this to everyone's attention in the last few years. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the stresses on the Western military supply chains, it emerged that a lot of the specific components were not made in the West. So a lot of the components that even Western militaries were dependent upon were not made in the West. Not all of these are ultra high-end chips. A lot of them are simple components. But if your system depends upon simple components that you can't master and that you can't provide for, it's a political problem, it's a social problem, it's a technological problem. The question is, what framework will answer it? And that's why we talk about post-liberalism. It's a bit of an abstract term, but what it means is we have to leave behind the expectations of recent decades and face squarely a world in which governments will have to take a more active role shaping trade policy, manufacturing goals. As Mr. Pilkington said, that's going to be quite a complex process. But if it doesn't happen, then discontent is just going to rise. And for everyone in the tech and the startup community, that's an important consideration because political risk and regulatory risk are real. They affect what companies people start, where they locate them. And so that process is something that we have to start paying attention to now.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to people who are trying to do AI startups, trying to do that, getting hold of fabrication, people will say, I would love to be able to get it in my country, I'd love to be able to get it easily. You know, the thesis that you need basic manufacture to have advanced manufacture, sure, but you end up having to bite a bullet, don't you, of people hate inflation. We know that if voters hate anything, it's inflation. It's one of the reasons, you know, liberal governments suffer. If you're going to bring basic manufacture back to high-income countries, you either have a cost hike, you either have very few jobs, or you're going to have pretty horrible wages, or some combination of the three. It's sort of easy to go, let's do it. How do you escape that trap?
Well, I think what we're going to realize probably in the next 5 to 10 years is that if we don't rebalance these trade issues, the trade issues will rebalance themselves. The reason that the Western countries, especially the Anglo-Saxon countries, have been able to run such enormous trade deficits is basically because of the Wall Street model. It's financial inflows. It's the purchasing by the Chinese government of Chinese or American debt and so on. You're seeing the gold price now above 4,000. This Wall Street model, this financialized Wall Street model is starting to crack. And what will happen if there aren't active measures taken to try and rebalance the trade somewhat is that it'll rebalance itself through currency moves, quite dramatic currency moves. And the high-income countries will be lower-income countries after that. This will probably happen. You can't run these trade deficits if the Wall Street model cracks. So what I'm advocating certainly is that we should try and manage this process in a sensible way. We shouldn't do the kind of Wile E. Coyote moment where you run off the cliff and then only when you look down you fall. You know, that's what I'm quite worried about right now. And I think we're actually, as I said, coming up on this now quite dramatically. There's a lot of signals in the Treasury market and so on that selling this debt to the Chinese now might be a little bit harder than it was in the past. So I think we should get realistic about that. I fear we won't, but I think we should.
And you know, what happened is that short-term decisions were made in search of profit, that led to the shuttering of manufacturing plants all over the West. So when the initial movement was made for for manufacturing to move outside of the West or to seek cheaper labor, primarily in China and in Asia, at that time it would have been relatively cheap to keep a lot of these factories, even chip manufacturing factories, running at a very low level, or at least not totally shuttered and abandoned. But once you shutter and abandon a factory, then it becomes much, much harder. This is just a matter of short-term versus long-term thinking. If you, it's cheaper to keep it alive at a low level, then of course you can take some quick profits now and shut the whole thing down. Unfortunately, we're suffering with the consequence of that mentality, and it will take the intervention of governments, particularly ones that have a more longer-term view, to change that.
There is an observation I tend to make when I look at, say, in the American context, senior Trump figures talk about bringing back manufacturing jobs, or people want to hand manufacturing jobs to their children, etc. Especially in America, but sometimes in Europe, it often comes from a class who have never worked in manufacturing and do not want their own children to work in manufacturing. I grew up pretty working class in a town where the main employer, well, one of the main employers was a chocolate factory. Kind of sounds great when you're 6, I'll be honest. But the people I know who worked there wanted their kids to get the kind of tech jobs that people look to do here, that people in the audience do here, or to be lawyers, or to be doctors. We kind of had this aspiration. And do we have the nature of a different kind of out-of-touch elite projecting what people want, this time imagining that factory workers want their kids to do their job instead of wanting their kids to do jobs that put them on stages like this?
And the educators have a responsibility here as well, and there needs to be better coordination between educational planning and industrial planning. We need to be able to plan for the manufacturing jobs of the future. If that's promoted in schools as a real opportunity, if there's training of engineers, for example, then the social expectations will change. This is like it's a multi-part process, but if we just let things continue to go in the direction they are, they'll become more broken and fall apart. Where there's advanced manufacturing, it's always become socially prestige as well. It's been abandoned. The jobs aren't available, so you have a large number of people clamoring after, like, well, can I get lucky enough to have the equity stake in the early stage startup, blah, 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 blah. This is important, but that's not a plan for a country. That's a personal plan. It's a plan of a certain sector of people. I know there is, of course, nostalgia is a factor in politics, but I think from the decision-making standpoint, we're not competing in the West in the production of engineers, and now with high energy prices in Europe, we wouldn't even have any, we're suffering a decline in manufacturing, so we wouldn't even have the excess of jobs in which to put them. So it's a multi-pronged process. At the moment, it's looking a little bit tragic unless we have this conversation. That's why it's so important at a tech conference like this that we have this conversation.
And as you've handily mentioned, we are at a tech conference, so we've got almost 20 minutes without anyone saying AI. So contractually, I think I have to. When you look at AI and robotics, at the extreme end, you've got someone like Elon Musk saying he'll start producing 1 billion Optimus robots a year and they'll do everything. You certainly have claims they'll take a lot of service jobs. You can see lots of ways they'll take manufacturing jobs and warehousing. Certainly look at Amazon and their efforts. To what extent could tech render both liberalism and post-liberalism's thesis moot if we have this extent of transformative tech coming in?
I'll give the really boring economist answer here, that we've actually heard this story since basically the creation of the spinning jenny in the Luddites, the initial attacks.
I mean, I would say since any tech post-agriculture.
Any tech post-agriculture. So I actually doubt that the AI revolution is going to wipe out as many jobs as people think. But the fact that people are talking about that and they're not planning for what that might do to a society, it's concerning. I mean, if you really believe that, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe they will wipe out a bunch of jobs, but if you really believe that, you should be planning. I'd just say one thing very briefly. What they're implicitly saying from an economic point of view is that worker productivity is going to go through the roof. productivity's been in decline since the 1970s. Productivity declines when manufacturing declines. So if I were a betting man looking at productivity statistics, I wouldn't bet on a giant boom, but that's just me.
No. So as we wrap this, what should a technology audience be thinking if they're looking at political stability? This is the 30-second soundbite that you get. If you're looking at, what's the post-liberal thesis to the tech world? How should they change their businesses?
Well, the move fast and break thing model of technology succeeded wonderfully, but it pretty much broke everything. And the expectations that we would have a rich and wonderful world just from tech service sector jobs, that has not materialized. But it's fine. A lot of good came from those decades of software innovation. Now, even in the US, there's a big reindustrialized movement in the technology sector that has actually come from tech people who are reacting against the, well, I'm just going to make another B2B SaaS company. Like, I'm going to figure out how to, monetize people's choices a little bit better. That's great if you can do it. I'm sure there's a lot of optimization that needs to be done in that space, but it's not going to build a better world. We don't need more B2B SaaS, sorry. I'm sure it's great, but that is not going to build the future. So we have to start thinking about what that is. What is the role of reindustrialization, and how can the tech mindset and software-oriented tech companies contribute?
Thank you. I hope that's given everyone some food for thought out there. And very sorry if you're in B2B SaaS. Apparently you're over. Thank you so much for joining us. Cheers. Cheers.